I'm Dr. Tom Insel, the director of the National Institute of Mental Health at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland, in the USA. I want to talk to you about the state of medication and treatment development for mental disorders. There's a sense in many corners that we're in dire straits, either because the pipeline has run dry, because pharmaceutical companies are largely getting out of this space, or because for many people there's a sense of not knowing where to go for the next generation of therapeutics. There's an interesting paradox that all of this is built around, and it's probably a good place for us to begin in thinking about it. The first arm of the paradox is the recognition that there's actually more treatment going on today than at any time in the past. We've seen almost a doubling of the use of antipsychotics and antidepressants globally, and particularly in the United States. These have become more than a $25 billion industry. So lots of prescriptions, lots of sales, lots of use of medications, but the inconvenient truth is that there's really no evidence that that increase in treatment has resulted in a decrease in either morbidity or mortality for schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder, any of the anxiety disorders, or for that matter, autism as well. So we're faced with this paradox that increasing treatment doesn't seem to result in a reduction of most of the critical public health measures, such as morbidity and mortality, for the disorders in question. There are lots of ways to try to respond to that paradox. It's possible that the drugs aren't getting to the right people. It's possible that the prevalence is increasing at such a rate that all you can do is keep up. But it's also a rather inconvenient truth that we have to consider that the medications that we have today simply aren't good enough. They may help some people to get better, but they help far too few people to get well. And the question that I think we have to grapple with as a field is, where will the next generation of more effective interventions come from? What I'd like to suggest is that there are really three ways we need to pursue this going forward. The first is we're going to need new molecular targets, just as in any other area of medicine, a deeper understanding of the pathophysiology of these disorders. In some ways, we've been victims of our own success. The serendipitous discovery of drugs like lithium and imipramine and the MAO inhibitors over 50 years ago has led to 5 decades of Me Too compounds, none of which appear to be much more effective than the original compounds that were developed, though they may have somewhat fewer or somewhat different side effects. The problem with all of that is that we've had a science based on pharmacology rather than a science based on a full understanding of the pathophysiology of any of the disorders that we're concerned with. And therefore, the difficulty in coming up with the next generation of medications is not knowing exactly where to go to get that. Of course, one of the opportunities now is with the explosion of information from genomics and from, in some cases, neuroscience. We are beginning to see opportunities for molecular targets that we didn't even know about before. And what's so extraordinary with the over 100 new genetic signals that we're finding from studies of bipolar disorder, autism, schizophrenia, and other mental problems is that, in fact, the molecular signatures that we're seeing seem to go everywhere around synaptic efficacy, neurodevelopment, other aspects of brain function, but don't generally align with the discoveries of where we've been. That is the studies of the monoamines and their receptors. In fact, we've been, in some ways, trapped into a very narrow area of biology. And the genomics revolution is now widening that out and giving us a whole new biology when we can begin to look for new targets. Now, we're not there yet. We don't have, at this point, the kind of targets we have for the study of hyperlipidemia or the study of, in this case, sickle cell anemia and other really exciting new opportunities that exist in medicine. But we are beginning to see some places where we can think about how to identify and perhaps validate targets. Some of that's going to require developing a new approach to clinical trials. Trials that aren't based so much on trying to find a blockbuster, but trying to identify a fundamental breakthrough, and actually using our trials through experimental medicine approaches to look more carefully at what should be the right targets for the next generation of medications to be developed. And we have ways of doing that through a whole series of interventions, sometimes called fast-fail, sometimes called experimental medicine. But these are trials in which the goal is not so much to advance into phase 3 as it is to work backwards to ensure that the target of interest is in fact a target that's involved with the process of the disease, and if that target is engaged at the appropriate dose, you can ensure that there'll be some therapeutic effect. That's quite different from the world that we've been in recently, which is one in which we've looked very carefully at whether a medication changes rating scales without knowing anything about what its effect is on biology. So new therapeutics will, to some extent, involve developing new molecular targets. But there's another opportunity as well, and that new opportunity has to do with improving our clinical targets. You know, the current situation that we're in developing therapeutics is a lot like trying to identify new antibiotics by making your target, in this case, fever. When all of your diagnostics are limited to the symptoms or the cluster of symptoms that people present with, and ignore the underlying biology, you're actually trapping yourself into a very difficult challenge of trying to come up with therapeutics for a very heterogeneous group of syndromes, which may share some of the same symptoms, but are hardly unique or singular in their underlying pathophysiology. So what we're suggesting at NIMH is a different approach called the research domain criteria approach. And that's an approach that actually does include a study of the presenting symptoms, but only uses that as a first step and maps out syndromes based on a whole range of really a multi-level analysis of the underlying cognitive structure, the underlying biology at many levels, from genetics to cells to circuits, right through to neural systems that can be studied with neuroimaging. The hope here is not simply a matter of identifying biomarkers, though that will be an important part of it. It's a hope that we can begin to understand the individual patterns of disorder that will be much more predictive of therapeutic selection. That is what we call precision medicine, identifying the many, many different disorders that may be currently comprised in a label as heterogeneous as depression or autism or schizophrenia. The hope is that in going forward, we'll identify those individual subtypes with much more rigor, and then be able to identify those interventions that are going to be most effective based on an understanding of the fundamental biology underneath each of these. Now, there are already, I think, some opportunities from careful clinical observation that suggest places where we can go in the short term. Rapid treatment of depression, certainly a very exciting opportunity. The opportunity to develop pro-social compounds, not only for autism, but for many of those syndromes involved with schizophrenia and for other aspects of mood disorders where social interaction may be a particular deficit. And finally, a focus on disorders or focus on compounds or interventions that may affect cognition, going after one of the sources of the greatest disability in many of the psychotic disorders, as well as in some cases mood disorders. So we have lots of opportunities. I've just mentioned those three very quickly. Rapid interventions for depression, a la ketamine. The second one are pro-social compounds. The third one being cognitive interventions, which in the short run, even before we have molecular targets, provide, I think, an exciting opportunity and one that hasn't been fully realized for making a bigger effect on the public health impact with new interventions. Finally, as we think about where we're going forward, it's not only going to be new molecular targets and new clinical targets, but in addition, the opportunity to change the culture of the way we do science. Going forward, what will be really critical, and we're already seeing great examples of this with some of the new collaborations that have developed, is the opportunity to get together in public-private consortiums, taking what is done best in the private sector, what's done best in the public sector, and creating these pre-competitive collaborations, partnerships that really focus on areas of the greatest public health need and bringing new diagnostics, new therapeutics forward to ensure that we will have a greater impact for those people who have the greatest need. The secret in all of this, from my perspective, is that we make a commitment that begins to put a priority on standardizing our approaches, providing an integration and ultimately a sharing of data so that we create, through all of these different sectors, a public good, a repository of reagents, of data, in some cases of tissue, that can have broad application so we can accelerate the process of discovery to ensure that we'll be able to have the greatest impact for those people who have these most disabling disorders. My summary of this, I think, is best wrapped up by just saying that of the dire straits that some people have predicted, and some people have described for our current state of research and development, I do think that by understanding the opportunities through genomics and neuroscience for new targets, thinking about this new opportunity with clinical targets that we have, and now the ability to change the culture, we can actually, within a very brief time, begin to see huge progress. We have a field that has never had a surplus of public trust, and part of that is because we haven't delivered for people who have the greatest need. I think going forward, the way that we'll be able to change the public trust is by delivering. And delivering is going to require not just this opportunity to standardize, integrate, and share, but by setting an agenda that's very different, that transforms what we've been doing into a way forward that ensures there'll be greater progress and greater delivery of real treatments, real diagnostics that make a difference for people who have this extraordinarily disabling set of disorders. Thank you.